That's really interesting. I need to read that book. I'll check it out. So I guess the sort of next bits to look at then would be, I mean, it's probably around Theodicies. So we explored quite heavily the concept of fine tuning, but it'd be good as well to kind of hear, Christians will kind of go, but why don't you look at this more in depth? So let's do that. Sort of, what are the sort of classic Theodicies placed to answer the idea of a sort of a God that allows evil and suffering to be within this world? And how do they not make sense for you? I'm aware why they don't make sense for me, but I guess kind of, the classic things being sort of free will, that we need to be able to have a universe where these things are tangibly possible for us to then be able to pick and make a decision to move further and further towards a God if they're real. And another one kind of looks at the idea of sort of soul making. So the idea that you need to have the evil and suffering that we have present for us to then be able to I guess, culminate enough within us throughout our lives so that when we depart, our souls go to rest within the abode of God, heaven, whatever language we want to use. That they're two that are quite often spun around the idea of free will, having conscious creatures making actual decisions to follow God, and around the idea of soul building or person building, that we need to go through this shit because that will mean we can actually go to God one day. And are there any other theodicies that you've kind of come across that are maybe better arguments than those, but why don't they make sense to you? That'd be really interesting, I think.
Yeah, so I think there are two ways of responding to the problem of evil. One is to construct a theodicy, an explanation of why God allows evil. The other approach has perhaps become more popular in recent times, so-called Sceptical Theism. Sceptical theists say all the explanations are terrible. I mean, you hear Alvin Plantinga actually. He thinks all the. You listen to him. It sounds like an atheist or something. He says, all these theodicies people have come up with are all absolutely terrible. So we have no good explanation. But they try to argue we shouldn't expect to know why God allows suffering, because God's so much more cognitively sophisticated than us. Anyway, that's an interesting strategy. I don't think it ultimately works out, but it's trying to say, even though we can't give an answer, we shouldn't expect to be able to give an answer. And so it's like the analogy they sometimes give: if you're standing on a skyscraper, you look down on the floor, you can't see any ants on the pavement. Does that mean there are no ants? Well, no, because you wouldn't expect to know to see the ants if there were any. So they try to argue we wouldn't expect to know God's reasons for creating the universe, and so the fact that we don't have a good explanation shouldn't give us any. We can't infer anything from that. Anyway, but just staying on theodicies for a moment. Soul making. So that was the theodicy of John Hick, who's actually my first year as an academic at the University of Birmingham. I went to do. He used to have talks every week in his front room, and I gave one of my first talks in his front room. He's a really lovely guy. He was actually the PhD supervisor of William Lane Craig. They are two very, very different individuals. I think John Hick was kind of very left-wing, very liberal Christian. He sort of thought all faiths are just metaphorical ways of getting at the same truth. And he believed in reincarnation. That was part of his soul-making theodicy. What we don't perfect in this life, we perfect in another life. Probably, I think, perhaps the most elaborate theodicy is Richard Swinburne. I think Richard Swinburne is a very interesting philosopher in lots of ways. I think he was the first person to really bring Bayesianism into philosophy of religion, and so he's a very interesting figure. But his theodicy, it's kind of close to soul making, but I guess he thinks that the alternative would be a sort of Disneyland where there's no serious choices and there's no serious there's no suffering to feel compassion for. So he thinks okay, so it's not, you could have free will in Disneyland, but it's it's not really a meaningful life. So you need a wider range of free choices, and you need some natural evil and suffering for those. So it's only if people suffering that I can feel compassion and that I can choose to help them and be courageous and risk my life. And so anyway, that's what he thinks. And, I can see the force of that. My response in my book is to say, yeah, I can see the force of that there are some goods that we have access to, like the possibility of being courageous and being compassionate, that you wouldn't have in a more perfect universe. But it seems to me the value of those goods is greatly lessened if they're just created by God for the sake of giving us challenges. That sort of creates a kind of artificiality. So I have this story, I imagine, I'm walking home from work and there's a burning building and there's a baby screaming in the window of the burning building. And so I bravely, climb up the telegraph pole and jump on the roof and jump in the burning building and rescue the child, jump to the ground, and everyone cheers. And then camera crew come out and say, "Oh, you've won first prize in, the Courageous game show." And, the whole thing was set up as a sort of test to see if I'd be brave. And that seems like, oh God, that's kind of sick. And it kind of really makes it feel kind of dirty now, makes it feel kind of really artificial. So yeah, I don't, and Richard Swinburne, he's quite interesting because he considers the possibility of, even if it's good to have those things, does God have the right to use people in that way? And I think it's quite credit to him that he considers that. He thinks he has a very anthropocentric idea of God. He thinks God is subject to moral obligations, and he thinks it's a moral question for God. Does God have the right? And I don't. It's credit to him that he raises that, but I don't think he really gives a good answer to it. That and it does end up feeling. He does kind of say things at some point like, if it were not for the Holocaust, lots of people wouldn't have been able to feel compassion. And it's just like, I don't know, it just starts to feel a bit sick in some way. And there's a good discussion on the Unbelievable podcast, Swinburne versus Bart Ehrman, and getting into these things, so it just does end up sounding a bit. And I mean, I suppose finally, so I'm talking along. I'm talking a bit too much now, but just finally, I suppose if there was, I just, another thing is, I just don't see any good argument to think the designer, if there is one, would be all powerful. The fine-tuning doesn't give us any reasons, coming back to where we started, it doesn't give us any reason to think the designer is all-powerful. So maybe if there was a good argument that the designer is all-powerful, then yeah, maybe we'd try and find some clever theodicy. But there is, in the absence of that, then you just take the evidence on face value. You just think, the designer isn't all powerful, or one of these other options, or I just, don't see why we should. It's like, so I feel like both the atheists are trying to find clever ways around fine tuning, the theists are trying to find clever ways around suffering. Just accept, you can avoid both problems by one of these middle way positions. That's the sort of how I think about it. So that was a bit long-winded.
If you enjoyed this clip, then head on over to Locals to access the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version, and everyone can access the audio-only version of the conversation. I'll see you over there.